Good morning, everyone. On this somewhat sunny day, also welcome to the first day of summer. All right, we're going to begin. This is our final session before of an individual presenter before the closing panel. And we have with us on this morning the Reverend Dr. Andrea White. And I probably should say this, I am Keri Day, a professor of constructive theology and African American religion here at Princeton Seminary. I just received promotion, that's why people are clapping, so I appreciate that. So we have the Reverend Dr. Andrea White, who is an associate professor of theology and culture at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. Her research specializes in womanist theology and critical theory, philosophy of religion, and phenomenology. And the title of her presentation will be Accidental Politics. And we have as the respondent, Dr. J. Kameron Carter, professor of religious studies and African American and African diaspora studies at Indiana University. So, Dr. White.
Good morning, and thank you. Thank you also for the third 9 o'clock hour, fourth if we consider Sunday night the 9 o'clock hour when we were in this room. I'm just a preliminary word of thanks to not only everybody gathered, but all the presenters and respondents. It's just been, and moderators. It's just been phenomenal. And to my co-conspirator, Hannah Reichel. Thank you. Okay, so when they ask me what we talked about here, I'll tell them killjoys, drag queens, refusals, signposts, fugitives, worlds, happiness circles, kenotic solidarity, creative solidarity, the worship of power, patient power, Black Madonnas and corpsed futures, socialism as private political opinion, Christianity's embarrassing absent body problem, the sovereign who is nowhere to be found, and the irrelevance of Karl Barth. Did you hear it all? The conference all in one sentence? In our meditations with and against Barth, the question of the political has been hovering closely over them all, never landing, never proclaiming to be this or that. Sometimes the political is a disciplining strategy. Sometimes it's an insurrectionary moment. And sometimes these two become partners, since the uprising often aims to discipline Barth. The first time I taught a Barth seminar at Union Theological Seminary, a student whispered very, very quietly, so no one could hear, a confession to me after class: please don't tell anyone, but I like Karl Barth. If the opening and closing remarks of our conference were to form an inclusio, I would call to mind the matter of embarrassment that Devin raised in the first paper of our conference. Barth is a matter of embarrassment for some scholars of Christian theology, and surely for those who foreground theology's political judgments. Successful attempts to read Barth and the political together is a consolation for the embarrassed. Reading Barth's theology as political theology might be a redemption project. The warrants for reading Barth are more perceptible if we may demonstrate his political sensibilities. But we still don't quite know what we mean by the political. Does the political calculate the social forces within a political economy? Does it look for hidden logics? Does it offer a grand narrative? Does it free history? Is it about bonding and gathering, or interrupting and dissenting? Or is it simply about how to seize power? At the end of the day, is it really only about tyranny? Maybe we'll hang our hats with Bonnie Honig's theorizing about the paradox of politics, or with Alan Badu, who tells us that The state maintains the fiction of the political. Of course, we ought not presume that the political is always good in our so-called redemption project. The politics of sovereignty and power in Barth's doctrine of God are precisely what get him into trouble. In necropolitics, Achille Mbembe contends that sovereignty resides in the power to decide who may live and who must die. To quote him, "To exercise sovereignty is to exercise control over mortality and to define life as the deployment and manifestation of power. Power appeals to exception, emergency, and a fictionalized notion of the enemy. Given our planetary crisis, it seems fitting to declare a state of emergency, yet emergency reproduces sovereignty. The sovereign right to kill is inscribed in the way modern states function. Sovereignty means the capacity to define who matters and who doesn't, who is disposable and who is not. The existence of the capital O other is perceived as a danger and mortal threat to my life. The state is thought to have a divine right to exist. Violence and sovereignty in this case claim a divine foundation. National identity is imagined as an identity against other deities. Social order by the nation state is akin to control, surveillance, separation, and seclusion. Stated simply, sovereignty, Mbembe contends, is the right to kill. Politics is the work of death. Necropolitics and necropower account for the creation of death worlds, new forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of living dead. Black Death is not exceptional. It barely registers as emergency. White supremacy usually kills without spilling blood. Under conditions of necropower, the lines between resistance and suicide, sacrifice and redemption, martyrdom and freedom, Mbembe argues, are blurred. Speaking autobiographically, as a thinker of womanist theology and Black feminist thought, I'm unapologetic about my approach to Barth and to his grand corpus through the lens of a culture critic. The Christ-culture relation is sometimes a question about theological method, but the upshot has practical and political import. James Cone once told me in my living room that liberation theology must not waste any effort baptizing Barth. And I'm not so sure the task of Black liberationist and womanist theology includes schooling those dead white guys in their lacunas. Theology works when we ask the right theological questions. How might theology, these were the questions of our conference, how might theology function as a site of resistance? How might theology serve as prophetic witness? Or again, speaking with my own agenda in mind, how does theology take on the task of addressing Black death and anti-Blackness as theological problems and Black humanity and Black life as theologically inflected assertions? If Barth has something to say to these questions, it may very well be accidental politics. The totaliter, the holy other God in Barth's Romans and in the early Barth is a provocation that I've always found theologically alluring. Relying on Barth's acute sense of otherness, I once tried to argue that radical alterity is the condition for the possibility of divine human relation. As Catherine Keller writes, this Barth, at once ethical and post-structuralist, seems at odds with the unrepentant patriarchy, biblicism, and positivism of the neo-orthodoxy Barth. His analogy of transcendent difference frees creation from idolatry. The provocation of the totaliter is not simply the philosophical conundrum of difference that defies discourse or challenges intelligibility. there are political ramifications as well. If Barth's repeated claims about the faithfulness and righteousness of God means justice, then what is at stake for Barth is the question of the reliability of the divine promise in history. Without much effort, without getting very far at all, the Totalitar has placed on the table questions about the intelligibility of theological discourse, ethics, a theology of history, divine promise, eschatology, and political theology. In short form, the question is, how does one read together the Totalitar with Barth's critique of the social order? How does Barth accomplish ideology critique with the Totalitar? Many a theologian has used Barth's doctrine of God against Barth. The Totalitar is the very thing that makes Barth the enemy to fight in political theology. For precisely here, divine sovereignty has turned tyrannical. And Keller, for one, in her, not in her paper presentation, but in her Face of the Deep earlier work and exegesis of Barth, she, for one, goes on to raise serious doubts about Barth's take on alterity with its hypermasculine imagery. Yet how can we receive, and I'm quoting her, how can we receive Barth's supposed privilege of difference when he marks the difference as absolute, absolved of relation, absolute superiority, absolute origin? The problem Keller identifies is much more than an aloof and distant God, but a God who dominates through intimacy. So I'm paraphrasing her at length here. The holy other incarnates in intimate proximity to the creature. Surely Barth is wrongly understood as maintaining a mere transcendence. God's otherness enables his omnilateral presence in Christ. This version of total presence intensifies its ontotheology and thus its potential for dominological abuse. It is not the specter of a detached transcendence that would pose the problem for justice. The problem, she argues, would lie rather in the very intimacy of domination, in the condescending lordship inscribed in Christ's fully human and immanent love. The Barthian Lord is all-powerful in the possessiveness of his love. The he-God does not stay aloof, but through the incarnation consummates his loving control. He penetrates, but is not penetrated. It is dominating in the name of loving, jealous control that drives women to shelters. To read the absolute alterity in Barth is to read a totalizing divinity, a violent divinity, a divine sovereignty that closes off freedom, repels the indeterminacy of history and the flux of reality. Barth is rightfully demonized and successfully lives into the caricature of the Barthian ahistorical who gives an ahistorical theology of history. Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith, who fears and trembles, the Derridian gift of death in the Akada, are in the end narratives about faith in a monster, not a Messiah. The God that a feminist reading fears is divine violence of the worst kind. It's a short step from there to political theologies that advocate genocide and an accompanying divine sanction. These concerns must be taken seriously if we are to take Barth seriously. One might also argue that the Totalitar in Romans demonstrates a Barth who takes history all too seriously. For Barth is entirely preoccupied with history's indictment against itself, the dissolution of history by history. My professor of Reformation theology used to say, "You always get the God you need." In face of this indictment against history, theology needs a God who is not reducible to political propaganda of the death-dealing sort. Barth would say, we need a God who is God. He says in Romans, no divinity that relies on any human propaganda can be God. James Cone's Black liberation theology needs a God who is God. Far from an empty tautology, Barth's assertion that God is a political claim as well as a theological one. Indeed, they're co-constitutive. Indeed, there is a perceivable link from the totalitar aliter to the sacrifice of religion in paragraph 17 in the church dogmatics to the political. So Barth's political problems, of course, extend beyond his doctrine of God. Barth is not as I like to say, is not the go-to guy for a womanist project, especially one invested in pressing for human agency that has been usurped. There's also the problem of his anti-humanism or apparent anti-humanism. It's the caricature of Barth as adversary to the human that partly hinges on a particular reading of his assessment of the Feuerbachian reduction that claims theology is reduced to anthropology. If Feuerbach represents a robust humanism, then Barth's polemic against Feuerbach is arguably the best example to sustain the argument that Barth is anti-human, although I must admit there are many examples to draw from. Yet we must read his view of Feuerbach more closely because in it we find not more ammunition to launch against the anti-human Barth, but actually a nuanced understanding of the complexity of his anthropology. Like his predecessors in the history of the Christian tradition, Barth saw the human person as a problem. Barth celebrated Feuerbach because they shared the same diagnosis of the theological reduction, even though they placed opposing value on the outcome. Barth identifies Feuerbach as intensely occupied with the problem of theology and acknowledges him for having, quote, penetrated, there's that word again, the contemporary theological situation. According to Barth, Feuerbach sees Christian theology better than it sees itself. As an anti-theologian, he was more theological than most theologians. His principled aim was to change the friends of God into the friends of man, I'm quoting Barth, candidates for the other world into students of this world. The Feuerbachian negation demolishes any distinction between the divine subject and the human subject. Ironically, Barth claims the negation is not a depreciation of religion and theology, citing Barth. When Feuerbach identifies God with the essence of man, he thereby pays God the highest honor that he can confer, a strange magnificat, as Barth puts it. Theology had long since become anthropology. 19th century liberal Protestantism continued on until it reached, on Barth's account, Feuerbach's inevitable conclusion. There had been a long-term operation planning the undercover apotheosis of the human person. Barth traces Feuerbach's conclusion all the way to Luther, as if the inversion of heaven and earth, God and the human person, is a direct consequence of Luther's overemphasis of the humanity of Christ. Hegel was too good a Lutheran in applying Luther's overemphasis on the humanity of Christ, which led to speculative anthropological consequences. Feuerbach simply illuminates theology's undercover apotheosis of the human person. Feuerbach has a head start over modern theology, given his resolute anti-spiritualism and his anthropological realism. He is concerned with the whole reality of the human person. He's interested in the unity of spiritual and bodily existence. Barth writes, academic theology begins with some sort of abstraction and moves into some sort of ideology unrelated to the real life of human persons in their cities and villages, their little inns and factories. Feuerbach seems to have seen Adam and Eve in their nakedness. Feuerbach sees the resurrection of the flesh as somehow the beginning and end of theology, even though he sees these things from a great distance. The sting of Feuerbach's question was its critique of the church for its lack of prophetic insight into the signs of the times. Barth finally dismisses Feuerbach, not surprisingly, because his theory, it turns out, is sheer platitude. Its content is so common, Barth contends, as to be uninteresting and impotent. There are strengths to his teaching, such as detecting the anthropologizing of religion, but it is ultimately shallow on Barth's account. The final accusation against Feuerbach, though, is not his critique of religion. Barth agrees with Feuerbach on this point. He agrees with the assessment that the human person has been deemed not only the measure of all things, but the epitome, origin, and end of all things. The root of Feuerbach's shallowness lies elsewhere. Feuerbach's weakness was that he was a non-knower of death and a misknower of evil. That's the language Barth uses. The non-knowing and misknowing in Feuerbach is closely related to his mistake in seeing the essence of human persons as still too abstract, too ideal, and too far from concrete reality. I'm quoting Barth here. The individual is too solitary, and therefore knowledge of evil and death remain hidden. This is the real weakness of Feuerbach. God has rejected evil, but evil's insignificance does not follow from God's rejection. That Barth takes seriously the pathos of human existence, the reality of evil and death, is an indicator of the import that Barth places on the integrity of life. An antidote to Barth's foreboding doctrine of God and the consequent anti-humanism may actually be found within his anthropology. One can trace direct links between Barth's aversion to the philosophical concept of God and his polemic against human imaginations that reduce God to a universal function of human consciousness straight to his theological anthropology. It is Barth's anthropology derived from a Christology where he makes the claim of the divine relation stick. Now, I'm not going to flesh out that with any substance Barth's theological anthropology here. And some of you have heard me call my way of reading a hit and run. And you could say I approach the question of Barth and the political sideways, sideswiping Barth in a sort of hit and run where I leave Barth behind, slightly injured and unattended to, as I take from him what I might find useful for womanist work, leaving the rest behind. So perhaps we should take on the methodological question of using theological work in such an instrumentalist or even irresponsible way. But I wonder whether this is, in the end, the very business of constructive theology that engages the fraught history of Christian thought. I also wonder whether this approach, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, does violence or pays homage, using Barth's work against its grain and sometimes using Barth against himself. I dare say this is precisely what we've been up to in the past 72 hours or more. So I will request of you some elbow room, as Jay so cleverly put it yesterday, as I launch my hit and run. I won't be offended if you decide to look the other way. My thought experiment is with Barth's critique of Feuerbach's Magnificat and the question of the human. On all accounts, political and ecological, the human project seems to have reached its end before it has barely begun. Indeed, the human project has always been provisional, precarious, and quite unfinished, even if much of its effort has been directed toward denying this reality of contingency. The question of the human is betwixt and between, occupying a liminal space between the lines of Psalm 8 and Job 38, made a little lower than angels, but put in its proper place by the divine inquisition. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Exalted or humiliated or worse, annihilated, the human hovers precariously between the possibility of the post-human cyborg on the one hand and planetary catastrophe on the other. torn ambivalently between striving for artificial intelligence above and a collapse into ecological disaster and species extinction that threatens in the abyss below. If precarity is a mark of the human condition, even more so is the relentless effort to overcome it. Human history is animated by an obsession with blood purity and the consequent compulsion of violence. Invoked in the name of human dignity, theology's imago Dei is simultaneously overdetermined and underdetermined, woefully overdetermined in its androcentric idolatries and pornotropic politics of representation, and crucially underdetermined in its claims of distinction and singularity. The people of the West would come to overrepresent their conception of the human as the genre of man with a capital M, to echo Sylvia Wynter's indictment against man. In the terms of this colonial vision, Blackness would be the name for evil and opacity outside God's providential grace, ejected from the plan of salvation. The Western project of the human historically manifests a hall of mirrors, a racial vision inherently mimetic and solipsistic. The quest of seeing and being seen is the paradox of recognition politics, is not so much a confusion between truth and illusion, but an endless practice of representation and carnivalesque distortion. It turns out there is an anti-humanist project deeply embedded within the humanist project itself. In the shadow of the anti-human criterion of man, in the wake of the coloniality of being, we seem now to reinscribe our own annihilation. The question of humanity has always been a principal matter for Black life, precisely because the humanity of Black life is persistently called into question. That Black humanity is a contradiction in terms derives from the reality that race shapes the modern idea of the human. Humanity, whatever it may be, evidently appears in degrees. And so I ask with Black feminist Zakiya Iman Jackson, what remedy, or shall we say redemption, is promised by declaring Black humanity? On its own, the declaration offers nothing to subvert anti-Black violence as a constitutive dimension of, quote, civil society. And justice projects aimed at inclusion offer hopelessly insufficient redress. The concept of shared humanity does not transmute into a political program, nor can it generate Black freedom. The quest for shared humanity in the name of progressive liberalism is a wild goose chase, if not a wholesale sham. The sought-after unity conditioned on that which is shared is, on a good day, nothing but benevolent heteropatriarchy all gussied up. Inclusion and recognition are, in the end, reinforcements for racial hierarchies in feeble late capitalist disguise. These aims are neither radical nor subversive. Invocations of humanity, shared or otherwise, do not prevent Black death. In theological terms, the project of the human is inexorably a salvation history campaign, a quest for redemption, a mode of future-proofing. Dolores Williams was onto something with her indictment against Black theology's presumptive assertion and otherworldly fantasy of liberation. I dare say we theologians have yet to fully appreciate her lesson. The point she argued is not liberation, but the divine human encounter in the wilderness. Not soteriology, but a theology of providence and the God-world relation in which human agency is not cruciform and human history is not triumphalist. Part 2 asserts the relative transient passing character of all history. Barth undercuts all attempts to attribute final meaning to anything historical. Barth writes in Romans, history has to forfeit its excellence and serious importance, for history is ultimately meaningless. By its whole course, history pronounces an indictment against itself. Almost some resonance with Afro-pessimism. What then of the project that does not seek to resolve or explain the question of the human? How might we imagine humanity otherwise? How is Blackness construed as lack, nonetheless not a void? What is power that moves against the grain, provisional, slippery, suggestive, imperceptible? Blackness is an invention that signals a symbol system for the abject, and Black life is lived in the presence of an always imminent death. Negrophobia is a repository for fears about sexuality and death, the preconditional backdrop against which lies the paradigmatic Western trope of citizenship and the inviolable masculine body. Blackness poses a problem for the human because extravagant objection is an affront to the human. Blackness is a vantage point, and as such, a resource for the political present, not because it reifies and valorizes the lived experience of oppression, but precisely because, as a limit concept for the human, Blackness compels us to attend to the imperceptible zones of personhood. To be clear, this heuristic function of Blackness is neither pedagogical nor theodical. It would be sacrilegious, in my view, to perceive Black death as sacramental witness. Suffering conceived as an explanatory analytic is a technology of violence. But if Black being embodies ontometaphysical exile and homelessness, then Blackness itself is best positioned to pose a problem for man, and thereby to confront anew the provisional, precarious, and unfinished question that is the human. Can Barth offer a theology of history that speaks to the logics of Black death, or the logic of Black time? Black time is predicated on a rhythm of perpetual waiting. How might this temporality inform a concept of the human as always unfinished, without ontological coherence, without optimism and its accompanying myth of neoliberal progress, yet not without its own dimension of futurity? When Black feminist Tina Campt calls a politics what Black feminist Tina Campt calls a politics of prefiguration involves living the future now as imperative rather than subjunctive, the future real conditional, that which will have had to happen. The grammar of Black feminist futurity performs prefiguratively a future that has not yet happened, but nevertheless must. Could Barth's ethics and eschatology illuminate the grammar of Black feminist futurity? Or better still, can Black feminist futurity illuminate Barth's ethics and eschatology? Is there resonance, again, with Barth's indictment on history and Afro-pessimism? In another place, I've discussed the uncomfortable irony in the notion that the logic of Afro-pessimism is actually the condition for the possibility of a theology of hope. The absurd logic of hope, a hope against hope, hope that does not romantically or redemptively emerge from the abyss, but speaks from the depths of the descent into the absurd with every right refusal of hope. A new grammar of the future is one such refusal. And I'm going to quote here Catherine Tanner at length in her volume, Christianity and Capitalism. She writes, in order to prevent the future from doing harm, instruments, financial and otherwise, are employed to collapse the future present. That is, what the future will turn out to be into the present future, that is, into the present view of the future. By virtue of such a collapse of future into present, the future one anticipates loses its capacity to surprise. And here I hear a theological subtext. I might be reading that into Tanner, but I hear it nevertheless. The capacity to surprise. The future to come simply reduces to the future it makes sense to expect, given present circumstances. Those circumstances themselves become a kind of self-enclosed world as one learns to hope for nothing more from the future than what the given world's present limit allows. what is reasonable to expect from within them, assuming their continuance. Present circumstances, still quoting Tanner, come to constrain imagination of the future. In other words, by setting rigidly circumscribed boundaries of possibility that cannot be crossed. As Tina Camp puts it, the grammar of Black feminist futurity is a performance of a future that hasn't yet happened, but must. It is the power to imagine beyond current fact and to envision that which is not, but must be. In theological terms, Black feminist futurity is a binding of ethics and eschatology. This is no otherworldly eschatology, but involves the quiet frequencies of futurity. Such futurity involves complexly mundane performances of everyday life, as Camp puts it, a multiplicity of quotidian practices in a chorus of quiet frequencies. I love this language of hers. Practices of diasporic refusal, fugitivity, and futurity. Futurity is a quiet insistence on forms of diasporic dwelling that demand the right to come, to go, and to stay, as well as to arrive and return over and again. In other words, a refusal of a regulatory regime, one that claims the right to take up space and move through it. Black futurity relies on a desire to be visible, to exist in anti-fragility, to live a future that is now, because the precarity of Black quotidian life entails a tomorrow that is fleeting and often too risky to imagine. It is the possibility to inhabit a future as unbounded Black subjects so that we may hear the hum of utopian dreams and diasporic aspiration. I'm suggesting Blackness almost as a counter-humanist possibility, but I want to pose a problem. I always say that my job security depends on the measure of a theologian's capacity to problematize. So a rather common intervention to the problem of human life rests on the hypervaluation of the concept of life, calling upon relationality that is thoroughly corporeal is a dominant intervention. But I want to end by calling on Excel Carrara, who raises a point worthy of our consideration. In sharing her essay on Blackness and the pitfalls of Anthropocene ethics, I'm going to stick very close to the text here. Extinction is not only the impetus to reconfigure human subjectivity, it is also the ground for creating a shared multi-species planetary community. The planetary dimension of our environment is our common ground. Death and destruction are the common denominator for a pan-human interspecies alliance. Hope for a new geological epoch is an occasion to strengthen the ontological dimension of human existence. All these claims represent the vitalist turn in critical thinking. Carrara is critical of certain brands of new materialism and vitalism, which make rather grand affirmations of relationality. All beings are fundamentally interconnected. Her point is that the hyperethics of relationality can only be maintained by the concealment of systems of racial oppression. She helpfully exposes the fetish of unity and the undifferentiated whole that is at work in this vitalist turn. The homogenizing consequences and totalizing gestures of Anthropocene narratives sidestep an account of social antagonisms, especially those enacted along racial lines. Post-humanist reconfigurations of subjectivity and its creative invention of a future people as solutions to our ecological demise hinge on forgetting of the atrocious making of another people by slavery. Instead, she argues, we must turn to the structural conditions that render possible the symptomatic desire to abandon race. We must revisit the conditions that make blackened life and death unregisterable and therefore ungrievable. There is no guarantee that post-Anthropocenian times will be non-racist. And in fact, the erasure of race anticipates a recalibration of anti-Black racist practices. Carrara controversially suggests that Black suffering is a crucial site of interrogation. The Black philosopher must register anti-Black violence as violence, she says. Like Calvin Warren, she is suspicious of the hasty impulses of an affirmative politics of life and relationality profoundly unequipped to recognize the mundane and persistent ways in which death and even extinction always already constitute existence for the fungible object that is for Black being. For Hegel and Kant, racial Blackness came to represent the paradigmatic figure of the non-human. What happens when we proceed as if we know this anti-Blackness to be the ground on which we stand? We might consider Christina Sharp's suggestion that living must begin in relation to this requirement for death. I want to risk a bit of triumphalism as I approach my closing words here. And as we prepare for the grand finale, which is the closing roundtable discussion, what if power is reconfigured as divine glory? And what if divine glory is primarily about God's divine yes to life? If I had another hour, I would make this case, especially in Church Dogmatics 2.1.31.1. On the very last page of Kevin Quashie's magnificent book, Black Aliveness or Poetics of Being, Quashie writes, "If I could, this book would not need to exist. Imagine a world with no pleading, no begging for recognition, no urgent requests to treat me with dignity while I stop at the store for a snack, while I go for a run, while I sleep in my bed, while I play in the playground, while I breathe. Imagine a Black world, a world in which Black people are human without qualification, where Black world making is God's love letter to Black life, where the world extends hospitality and welcomes our work not as a commodity to be exploited, but an offering, a gift." Quashie says, "I believe that we need the imaginary of a Black world and its gentle, nudging welcome. Come, baby, sit here and do this piece of your work. An ethical habitat that doesn't traffic in debt. Be like a poem, always, always worth the pleasure and struggle of the doing." What if Barth is right? That the power of God is not the most exalted or observable forces, nor is it either the sum of or their fount. Being completely different, it is the crisis of all power, that by which all power is measured, as he says in Romans. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Professor White. If I may just call you Andrea, my friend, for this wonderful just meditation. I think you titled it in what you sent me, musings, and they were more than musings. It was its own poem. So thank you for what you've offered here. And all I want to do, because much of it I'm still processing. I gotta work through this. So I just put together a couple of like kind of bullet points that can maybe stand in for loci for questions and for further musings. The most important of which, or the last of which, it's not the most important perhaps, but is the most least developed because it was the moves that I didn't have in the paper, the version you sent me. But I actually want to think about the most. And so that's the relationship of this reading of Barth in this meditation to Afro-pessimism. I think you may have given me one of the most, what am I looking to say? You've given me the most to think about a possible synthesis between at least Barthian theology, if not Barth as a stand-in for Christian theology, and Afro-pessimism. I'm not sure I'm persuaded yet, but I want to hear more. That's what I want to think through. I was like, okay, this is serious right here. So I want to hear maybe more about that. And particularly given that Afro-pessimism is going to read theology, particularly of the Wildersonian, Jared Sexton sort, maybe less Calvin. That's another story. But generally, the Afro-pessimists are going to read theology, as you say, as a kind of redemption project, and therefore as part of the structuring of the anti-Black world. But the way you just walk through this thing, it's like, okay. And I think it turns on how you've reconfigured life, right? That, turning to Barth, you've lifted up life, not merely as a kind of binary opposition to death, but actually as some sort of scene of refusals to make death a scene that incarcerates Black existence. And I want to hear more about that. And I wish that it would have been great and cool to have had more time to just process this. This is me just freestyling, just having just heard you. But I think the real nub of that question is Afro-pessimism's relationship to theology, if not to Barthian theology. And I would love to hear more about that. And having just said all of this and talked my way into this, I actually do think it hooks to the other question I'm going to ask you about womanism. So I'm gonna go from there, from what I just was thinking about after your powerful presentation, and there's more to that, to the things that I actually did write out, having read the version of the paper you sent me. And it comes down to basically 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 bullet points. I'll just indicate the bullet points and then just raise little things inside of them and then just open it up and have more conversation. So bullet point number 1 is theology. What is its task? I'm going to come back to that in the end, but I'm going to register it as the first one. The second one is the political. And I'm really keen upon this statement that I think you say, certainly in the version that I had, and I think you read it again in the presentation here. And you mentioned Barth's statement, God is God. And I think you say something to the effect that this is a political theological statement. And in my ears, I definitely hear it as a theological claim. I think we all do, God is God. I would love to hear you elaborate a bit more about how that Barthian statement, God is God, is a political statement. What's the politicality of the statement, God is God? To quote you, at one point you say there's a perceivable link from the totaliter aliter to the sacrifice of religion. I think you referenced paragraph 17 to the Barth's dogmatics. There's a perceivable link from the totaliter aliter to the sacrifice of religion to the political. I'm interested in that concatenation of terms. How do we get from the holy other to the sacrifice of religion to the political? What, again, is then the political for Barth? How is the statement, God is God, a political, theological statement, not just a theological statement? Or another way to put it is there seems to be some sort of presumption of what the political is in that statement, and what is it then? So next bullet point, and it did come up when you were really elaborating on the Afro-pessimist material, but that is the question of the human. And it's interesting here because as I was listening, you talk about the issue of the human, how the project of the human also hosts an anti-humanist project, which is to say also an anti-Black project. I kept thinking about Cohn's work, actually. I kept thinking about Cohn's dissertation, which is on Barth's anthropology, right? And in some sense, if you sort of read the emergence of Black theology through Cohn and Cohn's uptake of Barth, it's interesting to see and think about how, in effect, what that uptake did on Cohn's part was to muscle Black life into the project of the human as a project of theology, and doing that through his engagement with Barth. And so I'm interested to hear more about that then, because then it seems to me that as a certain species of a Barthian project, the Black theology project, certainly of the Lacanian sort, is actually invested in the project of the human. So then what's the relationship then between Black theology as a project and all of the Afro-pessimist stuff that you worked out at the end? You know, it seems to be there's a collision happening at that point. The next question I want to ask is really about womanism. In the version of the paper that you sent my way, which was so beautiful as well, you write this at one point, and I'm not sure if I heard it again here, but you write this in the version that I had. Barth urges a concern with Christianity objectively and not apologetically. Barth's refusal to give way to human history and human experience as an interpreter of theology is in a way his own form of cultural criticism. In my own notes here, I say, I hear in this a statement that perhaps connects to the question that you raised at the outset of your musings in the form of the paper I have. And I'm going to reframe your musing, your statement, into a question. Here's my question version of your statement. What might one find useful for womanist work, leaving the rest problematic stuff about Barth and his thinking behind? And I was trying to track that in your paper. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. And I would love for you to elaborate. What might one find useful for womanist work? I've suggested, and would like to know what you think, suggested a potential collision between Black theology and Afro-pessimism, precisely because it's invested in the project of the human, as Barth seems to be invested in the problem of the human, which is a part of the project of the state, I would further contend, and maybe that's also a hook to theology. But where's womanism stand with respect to the project of the human? Is there also a collision between Afro-pessimism and womanism then? Which is also to say a collision between womanism and Barthian theology, or theology as we know it. Your invocation of Dolores Williams's work, I think, hosts an answer, or at least a line of thinking towards an answer for that question. But I just want to put that out there. And then finally, you mentioned Black time, Black feminist futurity, and so forth. There's another section that I didn't have. I really want to read that. And I think the thing I want to ask about this, and this is undeveloped because I don't have that part of the paper, but I think the thing I want to ask about it is, interestingly, if Charles Long has something to say for us on this question. And Long is interesting insofar as Long was often a kind of contrapuntal figure vis-a-vis Cone, which positioned him as a contrapuntal figure to theology, and therefore perhaps even a contrapuntal figure to Barth. How Black time and Black feminist futurity, or Black futurity, is not the future of time as we know it. It's when we say Black futures and Black future, here I'm thinking also of Keri Keeling's work on her Queer Times Black Futures book. When we say Black future or Black feminist futurity, that future is not on the timeline of the future of the human. It's another type of future, right? Even though it uses the same word, future, as we tend to think about humanist temporality, past, present, future, some of the stuff I was trying to get after there. And I'm wondering, if a person like Long can help us get a bit more traction on how that future works. Let me try and play with it a little bit more this way, because again, this was the part of the paper I wish I just had time to read and just soak in and just meditate on and think with you a little bit more on. At one point in the talk, you were speaking, and I wrote to myself here. Let me see if I can find my notes. I found it. I wanted to ask this question. What's the relationship of Blackness, understood as opacity, kind of Long's opacity, if Glissant's opacity, what's the relationship between Blackness and the aliter totaliter? Barth talks about the holy other. In some sense, Blackness is like a holy other. are those what's the relationship between those two things? In other words, what happens when Barthian, and if not just Barthian, but Christian theology's imagination of God as wholly other, the very term God, what happens when that term, the wholly other, God, meets Blackness, in some sense structurally similar? They both occupy some sort of zone of an absolute otherness, but it's kind of different. And I think it does hook to this question of time. So I would love to hear you maybe just muse for us a little bit more about the relationship of Blackness, if not Black time, to the totalitarian. How do those things work? Because then it might open up something for theology, and if not just theology, more specifically Barthian thinking, to contend with when it says holy otherness, against the backdrop of a world that traffics in another type of holy otherness, namely the dark. And maybe this is another way of asking that question I asked yesterday. Is this another instance of theology / Barth playing in the dark? How does Black darkness, as a certain type of totalitarian relationship to the kind of holy other that Barth is talking about and that Christian thought has typically talked about? Okay, thank you.
We need clearly like 4 more days for me to answer these questions. And I'm very eager to hear from the audience and from online questions. So I'm going to choose one, which is hard to do. I might say something about, oh gosh, Jay, thank you, first of all, for your close reading and also listening to the revision of the draft you had. There's so much I want to say. Let me take on the Afro-pessimism question, and it may even be your first question. I actually think Afro-pessimism, I actually think we need to take Afro-pessimism seriously, even though I don't think we want to land there if there's a theological impulse. A theological impulse would resist landing there, at least a Christian theological impulse. But I have argued in other places that actually what I think we ought to think about is moving in and through Afro-pessimism to take its critique seriously. I'm also really taken by the critique by Jennifer Nash of Afro-pessimism, and she speaks of Afro-pessimism's ability to get at our political libido. And I think it does that. I think it really is really seductive. And it's successfully seductive. But I don't want to land there. So I want to take it seriously. I think there's a critique there that is about Black nihilism that in many respects is a realist account. But the theologian wants to move to a more radical position of hope. And by more radical, here's what I mean. I think that a theology of hope and a politics of hope, the ways in which it takes Afro-pessimism seriously is it agrees, like Barth agrees with Feuerbach, it agrees with the diagnosis and the diagnosis of hopelessness. And then it understands hope as a theological category, not optimism, not neoliberal versions of history, progressive accounts of history, not what else? It's many knots. But actually the absurd logic of hope, the hope that is excess, the hope. And I have, forgive me, I'm invoking Ricoeur again, but the absurd logic of hope comes straight out of my reading of Ricoeur on hope, the excess of hope, that which cannot be thought, the hope against hope. So the diagnosis doesn't give us a rational account of hope. I don't think hope is a rational account. I actually think that's what makes it theological, is that it's a limit concept, and that's why I emphasize Tanner's notion of surprise. It's beyond our imagination, quite literally beyond, which actually links up with your comments about futurity. And I understand futurity as a non-temporal, non-linear notion of temporality. But my answer's too long. I'm going to stop talking. So I'll let you moderate.